Hello, welcome. We're going to give people a few minutes to join and then we'll dive right into the topic. All right, so if you have any questions throughout today's webinar, feel free to add them to the chat and make sure that you're sending the question to everyone and not just the host and panelists. Feel free to also do any reaction buttons and to have a bit of chat in the chat. Today's topic is mastering change communications for scalable change activation. And our host today is Nellie Wartoff. She is CEO of Tigerhall and chair of the Executive Council for Leading Change. All right, Nellie, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everyone in the room, for showing up and for those 3 hearts already there by testing the reaction buttons. We love the emoji reactions. So keep it coming. There are like down thumbs as well. So anything that you don't like, feel free to give me a down thumb if you disagree. Okay. And we have people from Cape Town, South Africa. Amazing. Love the global audience. So we have about 100, just over 100 people in the room. So I always love to learn from you as well. And it's good to have all of you learning from each other in the room. So as we go through this over the next hour, feel free to share in the chat, things that you have tried, things that works for your and things that you want to share, maybe some like tips with the other participants here. So as we chat about these topics, keep the chat lively. So we have people here from Canada, North Carolina, Stockholm, Sweden. Hey, Stockholm. Kul att se dig här. And California. Great to see California. Alrighty, so let's get started with change communications. One of the most difficult things to get right in change is how do we communicate in a world full of communication? And when we look at change and transformation, 70% figure, no stranger to any one of you. Looking at where the 70% failure tends to happen, strategy is usually not the hard part, right? We all have great ideas and great strategies that we want to go out and execute. Planning tends to also go fairly smooth, like, okay, this is what we want to do, go live at this date, and this is going to happen in A, B, C, D, E order. But when it comes to activation, this is when it comes to the plan hitting the people, and that's when things usually start to go a bit more sideways. So when we talk about activation, and we say for scalable change activation, we're talking about the 3 C's. So communications, capability building, and culture activation. And this is really what is required for the change to go well, right? With everyone who's going to be involved in executing it and delivering it, because at the end of the day, if people aren't changing, then the change isn't happening. So that's what we refer to by activation. And if we look at communications, the role that communication plays in that activation bucket is very large, right? And it's usually the first thing that hits people. So it usually starts with communication that they receive, then they go through the capability building or training, and then the culture activation pieces come around that as well. But when we go out to the organization and say, hey, everyone, we've got this super exciting initiative coming, everything is going to change, please bring out your celebratory outfits and we're going to have some fun. That's when usually confusion sets in, change fatigue. And if we're looking at how communications is done today, it's a lot of top-down communication, very one-size-fits-none kind of delivery. You have 10,000 people, you send one email to 10,000 people, and then pray to God that they're going to open that email and that they're going to action that email. It's very manual, it's very unstructured, all over different places. You have some things happening in an email inbox, you have something in the LMS, you have a town hall going on over there, then there's suddenly a workshop, there's an offsite, there's just a mix of things happening. And I usually say that going through a change for many people is like watching a Netflix show and you see episode 9 before you see episode 2. That's kind of the experience many have. Like, who's the bad guy? What is happening? What did I miss? Oh, there was a town hall I wasn't part of, or this email that I haven't opened. So it's hard for people to keep up, right? And then we very rarely ask for their feedback until 90 days later. Here's a survey. Now tell us what you think and how this landed. So then when people don't get the chance to share their feedback and be involved in it, then also difficult to overcome that. So I would argue that the way that we're doing communication today is actually leading to increased resistance and confusion and change fatigue. And this is one of the reasons that I started Tigerhall as well. I was one of those mid-level managers in a large global organization, and I now know that I was what is called a change champion. I was tasked with executing change on the ground and bombarded with emails and SharePoint sites and PDFs and job aids and instructions. And it's like London, which was our headquarters, like London sending this to my guys in Thailand is not going to change their behavior next week. So I was like, send everything to me, and then I'll do manually what we now do with technology with Tigerhall, and have like 10 times the change adoption. So bombarding people with information is not necessarily what leads to more change, right? And we're seeing this in the data as well when we look at the activation gap between the number of changes that are happening. So if we look at the average change impacts per employee per year, that has moved from just like 1 or 2 10 years ago to now being closer to 15, 16 every year. So more than 1 change a month that employees are going through. And with that increase in activity, we've seen an equally stark dip in the organizational support. So when Gartner did this study 10 years ago, it's like about 74%, 3 in 4 people that went like, yes, I'm on board with this change, all great, let's do it. Whereas now it's about a third that are actually saying, yeah, sure, I'll be on board this change. So that poses some challenges, right? And this is the backdrop to why we need to change the way that we communicate in change, and why that old school way of just bombarding people with emails and town halls is just not working anymore. And the effects that we're feeling of this, right, is when you're looking at communication not landing well, people not receiving it, people not changing, you're seeing a big decrease in productivity, you're seeing talent leaving. I think we've all seen projects running over budget, running over time, and many just never ending as well. And a lot of that can be attributed to slower adoption, which is what happens when people don't get it or are confused about what's actually going on and what is expected of them to create that change. So we're looking at this shift from how do we move them from this one-way, top-down, very one-size-fits-none, scattered, fragmented, noisy kind of approach to communicating change, to how do we make it more two-way, more bottom-up. Personalizing is very, very critical. How do we do personalization at scale? And bringing out more storytelling so people can actually make sense of it. So coming back to that Netflix show, right? How do we make sure they see episode 1 to start with before we go all the way to episode 13? So how do we bring in those journeys of storytelling? So that's what we're going to chat about today, is looking at these different pieces of how do we master change communications. So we're going to talk about the type of messaging, the communication style, delivery methods, how do you do personalization, reinforcement, feedback loops, and then sentiment, and then feeding that back into messaging. So these are the 7 areas. And as I go through this, feel free to put questions in the chat, comments, and we will see if I can keep up with the chat and answer some of them as we go as well. All right, so let's start with looking at the type of messaging and what is actually landing when it comes to how do we go out to the organization to communicate these changes. If there's only one thing that you take away from this webinar, let this be that one thing that you take away. The fact that people are not afraid of change, actually, but they're shit scared of identity loss. The absolute worst thing that you can do to a human being is to take their identity away, is to make them feel like they're not themselves, is to make them feel like they're worthless, and it's to make them feel like they have no place or belonging anymore. That's the absolute worst thing that you can do to a human being. And what are we doing in change many times? We unintentionally do just that. And that's what we need to keep at the heart of thinking about what's the type of messaging that we go out to the organization with. And there are 2 different types of messaging here. So if we look at first, like what is focused on reshaping that identity or reframing the identity and focusing on that kind of messaging work, that's where we're seeing change adoption and sentiment being very different and much more vertical than messaging that is focused on reshaping the processes and the workflows. So let me give you an example to illustrate this, because this could be confusing, like, oh, but we don't want to change their identity, but then we should change their identity. So let me give you an example. Let's take Susan, because I love the name Susan, it's always in my examples. So Susan is an accountant, and she's in the finance department, and she views herself and prides herself on being the absolute fastest, invoice processor in the company. She makes that process so fast, and that is something that no one can compete with her. She's been with the company for 30 years, and people know if I want to get something processed quickly, I go to Susan. And that's her pride, and that's her identity in the organization, right? Now you're coming with your beautiful AI automation tool tied to the AI strategy, and you're telling Susan, you're no longer going to do this. This is going to be done by a machine now. It's going to be all technology doing this. How would Susan react? She would feel like, but that's me. Now you're telling me I am being replaced by technology. I'm being replaced by a machine. That's what we're doing when we're focused on reshaping the processes and the workflows. We're telling them, don't do this now, do this instead. Everything is about what you're going to change in the process. But if we focus on the identity instead and talking to people in a way like we are the most forward-thinking, let's say she's at a bank, right? Like we're the most forward-thinking bank, and you, Susan, you're one of our early adopters. You're so forward-thinking. We love the way that you always have so much attention to detail and like everything around her identity, but not tying it to that speed, but other areas that she can then frame her identity around instead. That would make it a lot easier to then introduce technology, because that technology would then actually amplify her identity as someone who's attention to detail, early innovator, forward-thinking, early adopter, and so on. So it's about finding those things in people's identities that align with your change. And don't just tell them to do a process differently or think how they like change how they do things, but what is it that is core to their identity that you can bring up in your change storytelling? Because no one has one identity either, right? Like people have multiple identities and multiple parts of their identity. So what parts of that identity can you bring into your change messaging? That's what we want to think about. So when it comes to shifting this balance, right, and looking at organizations who do this well, when you think about change communications, this is usually the breakdown. So if you look at reshaping process and workflows, you usually do a little bit of the why to begin with. You're building the case for change, you're driving awareness, then you go into the stakeholder impact mapping, the with and messaging, and then you spend a ton of time on communicating the how. So you drive all this how around executing the new process and what to do, and it's all focused on what they should do from a task basis. That's where you spend time in that reshaping processes flow. And then a little bit of reinforcement at the end. So if you even get to that sustainment. If we're shifting that to how we reshape identity, these organizations that do this type of messaging instead, they spend a lot of time on talking about the journey and talking about where are we coming from, what's the past, the present, the future, what's our narrative, and making sure that the change they're driving is fitting into that narrative. It's fitting into a wider story. So it doesn't feel like a ping pong ball going around like we have this change, now there's something else, and next month there's something else. There's not this like flavor of the month culture, but they always tie it into this wider narrative. And then spending a lot of time on that external orientation, like why? Why are we changing? What's the context? What's shifting in the marketplace? Because the truth is there are very few organizations that go and sit internally and think like, what should we change now? And then come up with a strategy, right? Like everything is usually externally driven. It's driven by technology shifts. It's driven by shifts in consumer preferences. It's driven in geopolitical landscape. So it's always an external factor. 9 out of 10 cases, an external factor that drives the need for change and the case for change. And many people, especially in large organizations where you're not as externally facing, they might not be exposed to those external macro shifts. So your job in a change communication lens is also to help them make sense of what's happening in the wider world. Like, why do we need to do this? We're seeing these geopolitical shifts. We're seeing the consumer preferences changing. We're seeing technology coming in. Like, that is why we need to build that case for change, right? And then focusing a lot on the how, like what are the success stories, like what kind of identity do we want to see, and making examples out of that. So it's more focused around like what is our identity, and there are a lot of good examples around this. For example, if your identity is we produce great fax machines, it's going to be very hard to make that transition. But if your identity is we're the most innovative technology company, then it's going to be easier to shift from a fax machine to a mobile, right? So it's also the level that you put that identity on. And sometimes, depending on where you sit in the organization, you don't really have power over this, but there are always small things that you can pull out when it comes to reshaping that identity as well. But that external orientation is so critical. Before we go to the next, any questions? I saw two things popping up in Q&A, I think. Let me get to those. One example, we're switching the messenger moved adoption. How do you measure signal versus saturation, and who owns the decision to stop sending? Those are very good questions, Lotus. Very hard to answer, like how you measure signal versus saturation. I think that comes down to, it's a little bit like, think of like how many apps you have on your phone, right? Like I think the average number of apps we have on our phone is like 450 or something. And is there a problem that we have too many apps on our phone? Maybe, but we're using all of it for something, right? So in my mind, it comes down more to relevance and personalization focus than necessarily like signal versus saturation, because what might be signal for someone could be saturation for someone else. And what saturation for someone else could be signal to someone else. So I think it's more about how do we make it more relevant to people so that they receive less overall, but focus on what's actually relevant for them. Because if 100 emails are all super relevant for you, then you probably don't have a problem receiving them, right? But if you receive 100 garbage, you're like, how does this apply to me? Then that's going to be more difficult. So that's how I would think about that signal versus saturation. Diane, yes, you'll get copies of this, absolutely, in the recording. All of it is available. Okay. Awesome, keep the chat going. Why is WIFM not identity related? See if I understand that. WIFM, so WIFM could sometimes be identity related, but it depends, like, because sometimes the benefit might not necessarily tie to your identity. But actually, like, I personally find WIFM also a little bit transactional, because sometimes there just isn't something in someone for a change, and we're trying to come up with these benefits that might not even be realized. And I think that's how we're losing a lot of trust in change. We're telling people it's going to be so great for you, what's in it for you, all these benefits, but then actually they might not materialize. And then you're sitting there with this big trust crisis. And then the next time you're coming with a change initiative, then they're like, oh, but you told me I was going to get all these benefits, and I didn't. So why should I trust you again? So that's why I think WIFM is a little bit overplayed. I think it's actually more coming down to like, why are we doing this? What's the case for change? These areas around external orientation. Why does it matter for us as an organization? And frankly, some changes just don't have a WIFM, and I think that's okay. I don't think we have to have a WIFM for everyone in all the changes, because it's more important to be truthful and transparent than having benefits for everyone. So if we go then to communication style and what actually works when going out to the organization and communicating these things, whether it is a WIFM or an identity shift or like how you choose to communicate it. Trust is the only thing that we have in change, is the only currency that you can play with. And if you don't have trust, then there's basically no point in communicating anything. So before you start communicating, I would assess, where do you have trust, and do you have trust at all? And if there is no trust in the people who are delivering it, then it is going to be very hard to communicate that change. And we're seeing this, I mean, you see the backdrops here, like people don't trust CEOs anymore, except for in India. People like their CEOs in India. So if you're a CEO, maybe move to India. But apart from that, people just don't trust CEOs. We don't trust media. We don't trust government. Like trust overall is just super, super low, right? So start an initiative thinking that you have zero trust and operate from that basis and think about how can you build it. And when we look at how do we build trust and what actually is the type of communication style that does that, this is Tigerhall data from last year, from 2024, when we compare how do different leaders communicate, and then what are the people's responses to these three questions after that kind of communication. So leaders who embody a more raw, authentic, unscripted type of communication style, just like speaking to camera as it is, off the cuff, the people who agree with, I trust my leaders' decision-making, my leaders are telling me the truth, and I'm excited to be part of this organization, is much, much, much higher compared to the leaders who embody the classic, welcome to this town hall. I am super excited to share this update with you. Like, it's clearly scripted. It's clearly 12 PR people in the room. It might even be recorded, as many are doing it now. It's not even live. And it's very formal and kind of that inauthentic communication style. So the way they show up is a very big difference. And I think actually this is one of the biggest challenges that we have with leadership today. And I talk about senior leaders in large organizations because they got to where they are today by having this style. This is what was rewarded in the more like military way of leadership. There was one point, I think it was in the 1980s, where it was around 70-80% of CEOs in the US had a military background. So vast amounts of CEOs came from the military. And that influenced why we have the org chart, and many of the corporate words we use are influenced by military language and so on. And he was rewarded to be very formal, and you should be perfect as a leader. You should have all the answers, and you should always just follow process and be that kind of leader, right? If that was how you started your career 30 years ago, then you've been rewarded for that kind of behavior. And it's so hard for these leaders to now change and suddenly become, this is me showing up. I'm very raw, I'm authentic, I'm unscripted, I just am who I am. Like, that's a very tough shift to make. So we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to make. And if you have a CEO who is that kind of old school military style, like people don't really connect with her or him, then maybe find other leaders that embody this and use those champions and sponsors to drive the change instead. Because if you can find these ones that are, and they are in every organization we work with, they have these kind of leaders. So you just need to find them and make sure that they are the ones delivering the message instead of your very stiff CEO, if that's the kind of CEO you have. And if we look at some like quick ways to increase trust, if you feel like you're coming from this like zero trust basis, two-way feedback loops make a lot of difference. Like if people feel like they're actively being heard and people actually want to hear what they have to say, that means a lot. And this does not mean setting up an email inbox and telling people, hey, email this email inbox and someone might reply. Like that's not a two-way feedback loop, right? Because no one goes and emails questions@corporation.com and then get a response in 90 days. So that's not the kind of feedback loop, but it's more the live, the interaction, like even just having like live chat on. We had this, one of our customers, about 20,000 employees, they were going through this large commercial transformation, and we had a town hall with the CEO. And the CEO asked us, can you please turn off the live chat? And I was like, the whole point is to listen to what people have to say. Like, you turning off the live chat immediately tells them that you have no interest in what they have to say. You don't care about their feedback, and you don't even want them to have an avenue to say it. It's not even that you don't care when it's shared. You just don't even want to see it. So I was pushing back like crazy, like you need to have this live chat on, because there is nothing that erodes trust faster than telling people, I don't give a shit about you. Of course, that person is not going to trust you if they know that you don't care about what they have to say. So real two-way feedback loops, very critical. Communicating when there are no updates to report, super powerful. We have customers who do like every Friday, there's like a Friday with Frank, and they have this like regular show where a leader always goes live. And even if there's nothing to communicate, still communicate and just say there is nothing to communicate. So people at least have the option to tune in. And this does not mean, by the way, some people think this means that, oh, just send people a bunch of emails saying that nothing has happened. But that's not the point. You don't want to bombard the organization saying, hey, nothing is going on. That would be annoying. But have specific forums where they can come, say, every Friday at 1 p.m. and they can get an update. So just some regularity and some consistency in it. Transparency, like the old good treat people like adults, is so underrated. And many people think that adults cannot take bad news. Actually, adults are mostly very good with taking bad news. What they're not good with is finding out in the media or on Fishbowl or on Reddit things that they expect to hear from their own manager. When they hear it third party, it's going to make their way to them anyways, right? So be transparent about the pros and cons. Tell them what's happening to the extent that you can. Of course, different situations when there are layoffs and the stock market regulations and so on involved, but to the extent that you can be transparent, be it. And in the age of AI, if there are people that you're actively looking to reduce and replace, tell them. They're going to figure it out anyways. There is nothing that beats transparency. Sharing a personal change experience is also a big one. If leaders can share, I'm also going through this change. Because sometimes people forget that leaders are humans too, and especially if you look at the middle layer, like the upper middle and the seniors, have them share how they feel about it. Like, and also have them share transparently. Maybe they're not very excited about that merger. Maybe they're also afraid that they're going to get kicked out in a 2-in-the-box kind of exercise where half of people are going to be part of a synergy target, right? Have them say that. That's fine. People are scared and have fear anyways, right? So a leader acknowledging it actually builds more trust than trying to pretend that everything is fine and well, because people know it isn't. And then last, like, fun fact, when we think of relatable environments, one of these things is having a virtual background actually decreases trust by like 30-40%. I didn't know this, but someone like had done a study on this, and just having someone with like a perfect virtual background, especially a virtual background in office, and just pretending to be like, yeah, this is like, there's nothing to see here, something to hide, that decreases trust like, yeah, 30-40%. So keep like blurred background, that's my choice. So do like blurred backgrounds, but try and avoid these like fake virtual backgrounds. It's subconsciously eroding trust. So that's a bit on the communication style. Do we have any questions on this before we look at delivery methods? Emmeline is ready. Do we have, Julie, ability for people to unmute? I see Emmeline raised her hand.
Yeah, of course. Sorry about that. Here. Give me 1 second. All right, you should be able to unmute.
Hey,
Thank you. Hello, I've been looking forward to this topic for a very long time. I sent Julie a long email. So all of the feedback that you are providing, I think all of us in this chat or this room fully understand. But my question is, the function of communication never sits with change. And so just as change has evolved over the years as a practice, I don't know. The change in of itself has to be with the heads of communications as it relates to change, because they are so far removed from the working sessions, from the workshops. They're not in the day-to-day know in terms of information. And so when they're trying to understand the different personas, understand the degree of changes and how to structure that communication strategy, they themselves are building this plan based off of what they did 10, 12, 15 years ago. And so there's a struggle between the change in the comms team as to who should own and execute all of the things that you're sharing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Emmeline, for that question. And I'm going to be a bit controversial in my answer here. I think that the most effective change and transformation teams are actually the ones who ditch their internal comms teams and just own the comms themselves. So the teams that are not having to rely on internal comms, because also internal comms, like, I'm sorry to say this, and if there's anyone in internal comms on the call, like, I apologize, but they're not the people who want to make things change. They're not the ones who want to shake and move things. They're not the ones who are the most ambitious in the organization usually. They're not the ones who want to go out there and drive behavior change and do things differently and shake things up, right? Internal comms are concerned with risk. And everything they see is risk, and it's fear, and it's scary, and it can go wrong, and they want to control everything. So their workflows and the way that they operate is very much optimized for doing things as little as possible or as controlled as possible. And that in itself goes against everything that we just spoke about when it comes to transparency and authenticity and being real and sharing bad news and being transparent. Like, every single thing that makes change communication successful and powerful is what internal comms are incentivized to remove. So there is this, it just cannot align. And unless you have an internal comms person who's like so forward thinking and so like into change and really understands this and can work with you, they're just going to keep killing you. So I highly recommend to own comms within change, have that run by the change and transformation team, and have you own all the comms that are about changes. Because to be frank, I've just never seen it fully work when there is that you need to run to the internal comms team to get them to do something. So, and I know that's not always possible and it can be hard, but I would actually, if there's one fight that I would take, I would recommend you to take, is that fight to own the comms yourselves, because that is one of the most important things in getting change right, and not owning it within change is just, yeah, it's such an uphill battle. So if there's one hill that you want to die on, that might be it, but hopefully you don't die, but you win the war instead. But I would say go to war for that one would be my recommendation. Okay, delivery methods, looking at how we deliver these communications, right? So the bar for delivery has been raised, and it's not SharePoint being behind this. That's not the inspiration. Looking at some surveys, I think this is an interesting one. 46% of people actually believe that organizations who are using email, just using email means that you're lagging behind with technology. So email in itself is already obsolete, right? Like that's not how people want to get information to them. This is a check I love to do. I would love for you to answer in the chat, how much of global corporate communications do you think is in written format and in the English language? So this includes change communications, internal comms. We have 85%. Any other guesses? 90, 98, 20, 90, 80. Yeah, pretty good guesses. Sabrina might have seen me speak before. It's 85%. So over 85% is written and in English. Now, one more question. How much of global content consumption, people receiving and digesting information and content, is in written format and in the English language? Global content consumption, so all the content that we consume at work and outside of work. 20, 30, 40, 80, 40, 50, 23, 15%. Adewal is the closest so far at 15. It's 4%. Oh, Sabrina, another, you have good hunches, Sabrina. Sabrina is spot on. 4%. So 4% of what people consume around the world is in written format and English language. So already there we have this big disconnect, right? We keep sending out written communication and PDFs and emails, and everything is written and documented in English from our big American headquarters. And then people around the world, they mostly actually consume local language video. That's the most common form of content consumption. When we look at time spent, so this survey is based around time spent on content, and that's where it's 4% is in written and in English. So that speaks to the need of being multimodal, offering communications to people in the way that they want to consume it. Multilingual cannot be underestimated enough. And I see many American organizations doing this, especially where they're like, oh, but it's a criteria to even work here, you have to speak English. So everyone speaks English in our organization. And yes, that might be absolutely right. They might absolutely speak English. But when it comes to consuming communications and information and training, like it's still so much easier for people to do that in their native language. It's something completely different. And someone speaking English in a meeting does not mean that that's the best way for them to, or the easiest way for them to consume information. So don't underestimate the power of multilingual and local language, even if you technically have everyone speaking English. And then allowing for different access, like mobile versus desktop. Fun fact, when we launched Tigerhall, it was mobile only. So we had mobile only because we're in Asia. And in Asia, you do everything on your mobile. Everything is super apps, like even work-wise, everyone is just on their phone. And then when we launched the US market in 2023, people were like, so where's your desktop? And we were like, desktop? Like, why do you need a desktop? You have a phone, no? Like, why don't you do everything on your phone? So it's very different how people prefer to consume and interact and work in different parts of the world as well, right? So keep this in mind across modes, languages, and the way that you provide access to people. And some data points around this, when it looking at audience reach, if you compare English and non-English and put these different formats combined, how big part of the organization are you actually reaching? So email consistently across surveys and speaking to organizations, like everywhere, it tends to be between 5 to 10% on average. And this is for like org-wide emails, right? So like a boss emailing a subordinate, that would have a higher open rate, but when we're talking like mass-wide communications. So single digits, town hall, you might reach 20%. Non-English, local videos popular, podcast is very popular with English-speaking audiences. So just giving people the variety gives you close to that 100% audience reach. and you see the power of something like podcast and video, like audio, and in the world that we live in today, that's a very, very powerful way to communicate. So don't underestimate those kind of delivery methods. Then when we get to personalization, a few data points here that you can think about when it comes to personalizing change communications. And many people would, like, they might think like, oh, we don't have data, or we don't have enough data, or it's hard to find, and so on. I actually think that you can get very far in change communications personalization with just HRIS data. Just the fact that you personalize based on how long they've been in the organization, where they sit, what their function is, like this, what we call static data here. Just these kind of areas, this already gets you pretty much 40% to personalization. So start with even something. And actually, one of the most underestimated one is tenure. If you communicate the same way to people who've been with the organization for 20 years compared to people who've been there for 20 days, not a good idea. You want to differentiate, right? And you will make people feel, the new ones would feel overwhelmed, and the ones who've been there for a long time would feel patronized if you talk to them the same way as you talk to a new person, right? So tenure, super, super powerful. And you usually have this data, like 9 out of 10 organizations would have this data. So tenure is a key one. Then this step is very influential as well, like workflow activity. If there's one learning I've had over the last 6 years, it's how powerful timing is when it comes to delivering change communications. So tying it into workflow activity, especially powerful if you're doing a technology implementation, for example, say an ERP implementation, being able to see what they're doing in the ERP workflow when, that's something that can then trigger your change communication. So people get it at the right time. So timing is a key aspect of personalization as well. And then this part, which we call the transformation response data, or that layer where you actually get sentiment, you understand their areas of concern, understand their WIFM drivers, their identity, what's their engagement levels, and so on. So that's when you actually get the response on how they're receiving the change communications, and then continue to personalizing based on that. So those are the 3 different types of data I recommend looking at. And you could even start with just getting basic HRIS data. This would get you about 40% there when you're looking at personalization. But there are different sources. And I'm always happy to spend more time going through like exact resources and what type of technology environment you have, what kind of setup you have. You can use different data points at different times. And also ask your IT team if you have a data lake, if you can leverage a data lake, if you use something like a Snowflake or a data fabric or some kind of data lake system where you can pull all of this in and then work with it in your personalization. Definitely recommend to leverage that. Then reinforcement. So reinforcement is so critical. And this is where a lot of change adoption drops off because we're not doing reinforcement or sustainment as much as we should. Usually comes down to a resource issue. We don't have resources. We don't have enough people to actually continue to drive reinforcement once the change has gone live. So how do we do this? One way of thinking of this, what is the most effective type of reinforcement? Where do we want to communicate it? Is think of where people are at. And if you paint this quadrant of where do we see a high level of noise and a low level of noise, and then a high frequency of usage compared to low frequency of usage. If we map some of these, and let me ask the chat here, what would you say are low frequency of usage? Like what would some of these tools be when you think of the infrastructure that you have internally and different platforms that you could use? Any ideas? SharePoint, Engage, websites, SharePoint, yeah. Good guesses. So intranet is usually one of those. Exactly, 10 points to Tracy. Intranet is one of those usually low frequency of usage. You might have an intranet where everyone hangs out every day. Tends to be more rare, but that tends to be low frequency of usage. Other SharePoint sites, as you mentioned, LMS platforms. A lot of companies are trying to do reinforcement in an LMS platform, but the LMS adoption is like 4%. So if you have single-digit LMS adoption, how are you going to drive reinforcement there is very, very difficult. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of change communications happen, right? Like we put things on the intranet, we put up SharePoint sites, we put up training, nobody goes there. So where do we want to be instead, where people actually are, and where it's like high frequency of usage, but maybe a little bit lower level of noise? Where could be some of those are like high level of noise, and then what could be low level of noise? We start with high level. What's high level of noise? Slack teams, other chat spaces. Knowledge assistant internal. Email. Exactly. Emails is probably the highest level of noise. And that's why you don't want to be there. That's not where you want to communicate, where people are just getting bombarded. And people spend more time cleaning up their inboxes than actually doing productive things in there. So email is one of those where you probably don't want to be. So where do we want to be then? If we're looking at where are people and where it's not as noisy, where do we want to drive them to? And something teams, CRM systems, all good guesses. Yeah, some like CRM system function specific tools could be good as well to drive reinforcement within, because that's where people do their work, right? And then, yeah, I like that, Joanne. Live real humans. Live real humans is high frequency of usage and low level of noise. Depends on the human. Some humans are very high level of noise as well, so maybe don't use those. But yeah, we want to get into direct messaging. We want to use team meetings. We want to use project collaboration channels, middle managers. Great addition, Sharon, in the chat. So this is where you want to drive not only reinforcement, actually, you want to drive all of change communications in these type of channels, but this is a framework for you to think about it. Like, how are you actually getting through to people? And I still see so many change teams over-indexing on emails and SharePoint sites, and then they send emails to drive people to a SharePoint site, and then they wonder why the change isn't adopted, because it's noisy and people just don't go there. So getting through to middle managers, they're critical. Change agent networks, again, super great to use agent networks. That works well. And then direct messaging, getting into people's DMs, sliding into DMs is effective. And then the project collaboration channels. This is one of the most underestimated, I think, when you think of like your team's channels, and how can you get directly into those spaces where people are already collaborating, because that's where they hang out. So depending on your usage of Microsoft Teams, many spend, like if you're using Teams properly, many spend like 60-70% of their day inside Teams. So the more you can get into those environments, or Slack, the better, right? So maybe not worth spending all of that time and attention drafting a beautiful email. Maybe it's better to just DM people. I actually met a chief transformation officer of an energy company out in California who spent her time just direct messaging people on Teams. So she cut everything else, like no PDFs, no PowerPoints, no town halls, no emails. She was just DMing people. So, and she had super high change adoptions. Like, that's great. Whatever floats your boat. And I think that works well. So think of that when it comes to reinforcement. Then the feedback loop. So this is where we want the real feedback loops, right? Not the email this address and 90 days later, you may or may not get a response if we care about you, which we don't, so you'll never get a response. That's not a feedback loop. When you think about feedback, these are the things that you want to capture in that feedback loop, right? Like, you want to capture, what are people thinking and feeling? What's their sentiment? What are they concerned about? What drives them? What engages them? And so on. And when I think about feedback loops, I think it's like a triple I strategy. So when you think of how you want to set these up, you want to make sure that they're instant. So no 90-day delay, no like survey in a week, no survey by the end of the year. You don't want to survey fatigue people, because also part of a survey is that you don't really remember what they're asking about, right? Like, I actually received an email this week. I was like, hey, we saw that you had negative feedback on the NPS survey for like one of our vendors that we're using. Like, oh, like we want to get your feedback. I'm like, huh? And when did I fill out a survey? And turns out I filled out this NPS survey in May. So May this year, I told them, I'm not happy with your service. We're going to cancel this contract. And now I got an email in November. What is that? Like, so now they collected all the feedback from the year and decided to email everyone end of year before the contracts run out. That's not a feedback loop. So it needs to be instant. And that's also why after this webinar, you're also going to get a feedback loop right away. So when this webinar closes, it's going to be a survey there. So it's going to be instant. So while you remember it fresh, fill out your feedback. So instant is key. Interactive is very important. Not this like sending things into a black hole, but how can you make it more conversational, more two-way, more simple? And this is why I also think that DMs work particularly well. Just telling people, hey, how did you feel about that? Right after something happened, instead of, we would love to know your feedback. Please take 15 minutes to respond to this survey. Like, that's not interactive, right? That's just like very formal, and people are like, oh, I don't want to do that. And that is the last I, which is that informal piece. If you use more informal language when you ask for feedback, you're going to get much more feedback. So literally that, hey, how's it going, might actually give you more valuable sentiment feedback than going to the organization with that like 30 questionnaire that you spent 2 months developing, and the initiative already happened 6 months ago, so nobody remembers. So instant, interactive, and informal, those are the 3 ways that you want to think about feedback loops. And that makes them faster and usually actually easier to set up as well when it's more informal and just like catching people's vibes in a way, instead of making it this like whole research exercise that nobody wants to be a part of. And lastly, then, looking at addressing sentiment. When we have this feedback, right, how do we actually address it? Couple of things here. So this is where AI is a great friend. If you haven't used AI for sentiment analysis yet, you have not been using your 2025 very well. So start doing that right away. So when we look at generating sentiment analysis, input that you can put in are like quick NPS, pulse surveys, quizzes. If you do that research exercise, put it in AI at least. Comments, reactions, chat messages, transcripts, Microsoft Graph data as well. The Microsoft Graph API is something that you can ask your IT team about. That's how you get access to everything happening in your Microsoft ecosystem. So think like emails, SharePoint sites, chats, like everything happening in Microsoft. So take what you can to get input as much as possible. Doesn't need to be structured, can be completely unstructured, and just putting that in. And then on the treatment side, you have the prompt engineering, right? And this is whatever LLM you're using. And there are different prompts. Maybe we can share this afterwards as well. Some like good prompts to get like user stories. So generating user stories of how people are actually going through the change, how they're feeling about it. Heat maps, some LLMs can do this as well. And like word clouds, looking at where are we seeing positive trends, negative trends, what kind of words are people using in their feedback. And one thing I would say is like many do this once. So, and then they think like, oh, it wasn't very useful. Like I got this, like we actually did this one, and the word that popped up was espresso, because people had some very intense coffee conversation in the 2-way feedback loops. So that just turned, oh, the sentiment here is espresso in this word cloud, right? That doesn't mean that what they think about your ERP implementation is espresso. So don't do it once. It's actually more useful when you look at it as a trend over time. Sometimes even the second time isn't very useful, but the third will be useful, and the fourth and the fifth, and then we can see things changing over time. That's when you actually get the most value out of it. So just start doing it, even if it's as small as you did a pulse survey and you had like a free field, open field question where people could type in, just putting that in, getting something out of it, and then start doing more and more. So no need to go all like rocket science here. Just start with something, and then you can compare changes over time. And when it comes to addressing it, this is also critical, right? When we have those feedback loops, we need to address it. This is still a big mistake that people make. They create this big research exercise, they get all the data, and then they put it in an executive report, and they go to the steerco and say, oh, this was our feedback on the initiative. Okay, but all the people who gave you that feedback, what happened to them? It's like now the executives know everything, and the people are like, okay, I told you all my feelings and all my secrets, and you treat me like I'm not worth anything. So we need to address it back, right? We need to use this information for something, and how we then leverage change. And that's why change needs to be the circle of motion. It cannot be this project start to finish. Build compounding intelligence, learn about your organization, learn about your different audiences, and then leverage that data to address them. So if you're looking at, for example, let's say a super simple sentiment analysis, right? You have your team, marketing, finance, HR. They're concerned about job security, useless change, and they don't trust leadership, for example. A very common mistake is to then say that, okay, marketing is concerned with useless, like the change is useless, finance doesn't trust leadership, and HR is concerned about job security. So we're going to communicate to marketing why this is a great change. We're going to tell finance, like this, why you want to put a trustworthy leader there, and we're going to tell HR that your job is safe, for example. That's the common way that people take this kind of feedback and then address it. Don't do that, because then what happens to all these other people, right? A smarter way is to instead do it based on the sentiment that they have. So everyone who is concerned about job security, address them around job security instead, because they actually have more in common with their colleagues in marketing and finance who are also afraid of job security than they have with their other HR colleagues who are concerned about something else. So segment based on what the sentiment and what the concern is, not looking at what's most popular in a certain department and then go after the entire department. So be a little bit smarter in your segmentation. That's one way in addressing it. And then something that people forget is reinforcing positive sentiment. So people tend to over focus on what's negative and say that, oh, people don't like this or they don't agree and we have these concerns. Like, actually focus more of your energy on the champions and where it's going well and the positives, and channel your energy into energy. Whenever I meet change leaders who are very like tired or worn out and just depressed in some cases, I'm like, do you spend more of your time with detractors or with champions? And the answer is always detractors. And I'm like, why do you spend your life with people who are detractors? Like, of course you're going to be depressed. Go spend your energy with the champions and amplify them and reinforce what they're thinking and make them look great across the organization, right? Because every change has people who love the change and are so gung-ho. Even if it might just be 2 or 3, get those 2 or 3 and then go spend your time with them. It's also a lot more fun for you. And the point of life is to have fun, right? So don't overemphasize on the detractors. Spend more time with your champions and reinforce them. And then there's something called the influence attitude matrix. There's actually a podcast episode I did with a change leader on this, which is on The Only Constant, the podcast show that I run. And she spoke about this influence attitude matrix much better than I can. But essentially looking at who has influence and who has different types of sentiment, right? So if we're looking at how people are mapping to this, you might have people who have very positive sentiment and high influence. How do you then map them to people who have more negative sentiment and low influence, for example? So you can look at that when it comes to change champion networks, and how do you pick the ones, again, when it comes to reinforcing positivity, reinforcing championness, picking the right people, and then leveraging that as you go. And you can then take, if you know that this is how people are mapping, then identify the ones that are higher influence and positive, and then the ones who are lower influence. Maybe you don't connect those two, but the ones who are a little bit closer to each other in sentiment. That's another good way of addressing sentiment and leveraging the feedback that you have, is around how do you take that feedback and then actually leverage it in how you select your change champions and who those change champions influence as well. Quite hard for a super high positive, super high influence to then address someone who's low influence and negative, but the closer they are, the usually more powerful. So that's another tool in the toolbox that you can think of and apply if and when relevant. So that's really all of these things coming together. And that also then feeds into the circle, right? Everything comes back in this compounding intelligence. When you get the sentiment, that then feeds into the type of messaging. So you can also address the type of personas, the type of sentiment, the type of concerns with your type of messaging. Deliver that in a good style, delivered in good formats, personalized to the people, reinforce and sustain it, collect the feedback, and then it goes round and round. So think of it as this circle when it comes to change comms, and leveraging data is critical, personalizing is critical, and making sure that it goes all in this loop. And this is something that Tigerhall covers as well. So this is one of the reasons I started Tigerhall, as I mentioned, is that I thought change communications was done terribly, and it was not good for me as a middle manager and change champion or my teams going through it. So these are the 5 areas that Tigerhall supports with technology as well. So if you're doing this manually at the moment, you're a small team, you feel like this is too much work, then do take a look at a Tigerhall, and we can support with creating those delivery methods, making sure everything is personalized to personas, reinforce it, sustain it at the right time, and get all of that feedback so that you can actually address that feedback effectively as well. So it gives you this change activation system where it's easy for you to leverage the data, capture data, and continue to use that in your change activation work as well. So that's what I had to share. And I think we have a few minutes for questions, maybe 1 or 2 in the last 5 minutes. And then all of you are going to get this presentation and so on as well. Oh, thank you, Sharon. I appreciate you being here.
All right, I've unmuted Lotus. Lotus, you want to go ahead and ask your question? Try to click the unmute button. It should be at the bottom where your
Thank you
audio
so
is.
much for the opportunity to be here. Excellent webinar and information, and everybody in the chat sharing all these nuggets of knowledge. And you have just touched base on what I use in my practice of influencing and using the templates of the formal org charts and then overlap that with the influence map that we created. So that was my experience that I wanted to share, and that, oh, you already have that in the in the PowerPoint, but that's what we've been doing. So currently I'm doing a project with over 15,000 employees going through a change. And we started before the project with those influencing governance model and utilize those that are the influencers within the organization, map that over the org charts and the governance model to help us push the change. And so that's how we are using the communication tools. And the other tool that I'm using is I created a formula for measuring the feedback through leadership decision effectiveness, so blending processes and outcomes, and to help that in a pre-mortem before we start with listening sessions and listen and learn and synthesizing that information before we start the change. So I really want to thank you, Nelly, for this comprehensive presentation. And there's so much information in there that is applicable for what I'm working on right now. And I really appreciate that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lotus. And thank you everyone in the chat as well. I'm so grateful that that you're here and that you show up for these and that you find them helpful. So always happy to help with anything else that I can as well. So these are my contact details. If you want to reach out for a one-to-one or a deep dive about anything of these, anyone in the audience, feel free to reach me directly on email. And that's my phone number as well. So slide into my DMs. And thanks again for having me here. See you around soon.